Welcome everyone, and welcome to this special edition of this Princeton School of Public International Affairs webinar today, where we're sort of documenting and covering the situation in Syria. A week ago, almost a week ago, the unthinkable happened. Bashar al-Assad left Syria after the rebels had approached Damascus and fled to Russia. For those of us who study the Middle East, it was seen as an unprecedented moment, a moment that was not necessarily in our calculations. As you all know, Syria has suffered from civil war for well over a decade. And by all accounts, the Syrian regime had firmly restored its rule in Syria. So many of us were surprised. At the Princeton School for Public International Affairs, we like to sort of bring you up-to-date information and analysis on the ongoing situation in the region. And today I'm joined by three of our esteemed colleagues to help us sort of dissect what's going on in Syria. First, we have Zaid Al-Ali, who is a visiting research fellow and visiting lecturer at Princeton University and the senior program manager on constitution building for the Arab region at International IDEA. Since 2015, he has been advising transitions, constitutional negotiations, and peace processes in countries including Iraq, which is his home country, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Sudan, Yemen, Lebanon, and others. Deborah Amos is the Ferris Professor of Journalism in Residence at Princeton University, a longtime international correspondent. Amos spent much of her award-winning career at NPR, The Morning Edition. Her reporting on the Middle East and refugees in the U.S. regularly featured on NPR's Morning Edition, Weekend Edition, All Things Considered. She recently covered the Syrian and Iraqi refugee crisis, the economy in the Middle East, and the Arab youth surge. Previously, she reported for ABC's Nighttime and PBS's Frontline. Marwan Muashar is Vice President for Studies at Carnegie, where he oversees research in Washington and Beirut on the Middle East. Muashar served as Foreign Minister from 2002 to 2004 and Deputy Minister from 2004-2005 of Jordan, and his career has spanned the areas of diplomacy, development, civil society, and communications. We are so indebted to all of you and honored that you have joined us, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. So let me begin by asking each of you, did you at all anticipate this regime turnover in Syria? And why did it happen now, not a decade ago, not 5 years ago, but in this particular moment? And we'll start with Zaid.
Great. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for hosting. And thanks everyone for being here. The short answer to the question is no, I did not anticipate it. I wasn't even thinking about Syria. I was so preoccupied with developments in other parts of the region, including Lebanon and Sudan, that it wasn't on my radar at all. In retrospect, obviously, it makes sense that it should have happened for the reasons that I think are now part of the common narrative, which is that Bashar, the Ba'athist regime, their allies had really taken a big blow and were too preoccupied in other parts of the world, and so therefore weren't willing to put up any resistance to HTS's front. The only thing that I can say as well, in addition, is that what I did anticipate and is happening is that in Baghdad, which is part of the story, Iranian influence has started declining and is accelerating as well. It's different because they don't have military assets in Baghdad, but their soft influence is definitely declining. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaid. Deb.
So I'm going to spare all the thank yous because they did that. And I want to say anybody who tells you they knew it was coming is probably lying. But I spent some time this week trying to report it out because I certainly didn't get it. And I've been doing Syria for a long time. So two analysts said this. One is Putin wanted Bashar to change. He wanted him to make an accommodation with his Sunni majority and figure out something to do with the Kurds, maybe some autonomy, something that it would be less friction in the country. And he absolutely said, no, I don't change. Sorry, not me. The Turks tried to do the same. Erdogan wanted the same, a more stable Syria. Okay, the war's over, 4 years over. You're never going to get your sanctions lifted unless you change. Could you do that? And he yet again said, sorry, no, I don't do that. That's not me. And so it appears that what the Turks said to HTS, which is the strongest rebel group that has taken over Damascus, go take Aleppo, if you don't mind. And I think when they got to Aleppo, they realized the state has collapsed. Not a surprise. You know, there's been sanctions. Syria is a narco state. Their biggest product is Captagon, a drug like speed. And so they saw what nobody else could see standing in Aleppo, which is the regime had already fallen, all but fallen, and they just went ahead.
Thank you, Deb. Marwan.
I'll add my voice to Deb and Zaid. Nobody could have, guessed that the regime would fall now. But I think we should all remember that the regime has survived so long because of Iranian support, because of Russian support. The army was already weak. And as Deborah said, once Aleppo fell, particularly because of the weakening, of course, also of Hezbollah, once Aleppo fell, it was over. This is a dogmatic regime that has resisted all calls for reform, for inclusion. Since 2012, there have been numerous UN resolutions. There have been numerous UN mediators. And there have been many countries, Turkey, the Emirates, the Saudis, a lot of people who have tried, Russia, certainly, as also Deborah said, a lot of countries who have tried to talk Bashar into a minimum form of a political process that would include the opposition, and he said no. In the end, he did not find anybody to defend him. Even his own army, which is poorly fed, poorly paid, and we've seen this in Afghanistan before. We've seen it in Iraq before. The army was not ready to defend him anymore.
Thank you for that, Marwan. And so keeping this with you, Marwan, for those of us watching how the events unfolded, although nobody anticipated it, it did appear, and I'm not saying that it was, but it did appear to sort of unfold so smoothly, if you may, almost in this choreographed fashion, right? With basically Turkey, the United States, Israel, Qatar, the Saudis, UAE, the opposition, the Bashar regime, like everybody just moving towards this transition of power. So I'd like you to comment about that, but also what does this then mean now for the regional balance or distribution of power in the region? And specifically, what does this mean sort of for the future role of, let's say, the Gulf and normalization with Israel, Israel's position in the region? Is this really playing in Israel's favor with the United States? Well, what about Turkey and Qatar and that access? And what will this mean for Gaza as well? That's a lot that we're putting on your plate, Marwan.
Look, there have been a lot of conspiracy theories that we have heard over the last few days. Has there been a conspiracy with Israel? Has been a conspiracy with Russia? All kinds of conspiracy theories being talked about. To me, the departure point is this.
Yes.
There is no question in my mind that a majority of the Syrian population wanted to see Assad go, that they are over the moon, that they feel a brutal regime is gone, and they feel a sense of relief. There is no question about that. Now, having said that, what is the day after? Are we going to see a regime that is going to be inclusionist, that will have in mind all the components of Syrian society, or are we going to see an Islamic jihadist regime that is going to be along the lines of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in parts of Syria in 2014 to 2016? And the answer is not clear. Certainly, the regime's rhetoric has been way better than what we have heard from Jabhat al-Nusra or Al-Qaeda before. But of course, rhetoric alone is not going to do it. Now, neighboring states have every interest in ensuring that it is not a jihadist regime. Already there has been a meeting in Aqaba of foreign ministers of many Arab countries and others, Turkey and Russia, others, to talk about, what the regime might look like.
Right.
Interestingly, of course, these are all, or many of them are not democratic regimes, but they want to preach democracy to, and so good luck. We don't know where that will end. But I do want to say something more.
Yes.
This regime, the new regime in Syria, does need the international community. It is a regime that wants to reconstruct Syria. It is a regime that wants the refugees back. It is a regime that wants the sanctions to be lifted. All of that means that they are in need of the international community. And there is a chance here for the international community not to do what it did with Iraq, which is turn the other way with Iraq and allow the Iranians to come in. I think there is a chance for neighboring states, but for the international community to conditionally support the new regime. In other words, place its support or condition its support on the new regime doing what it said it would do. Incorporate armed groups into the army, have an inclusion in Syria, produce a transitional government that includes all the components of Syrian society, the Alawites, the women, Christians, Druze, everyone, Kurds, and of course then have elections in which the Syrian population will choose their representatives. All these are big ifs. This is an Islamist regime that is not used to notions of democracy. On the other hand, as I said, the hope is that they have learned some lessons from what they did wrongly before in Iraq, in Syria also, and other places. And there is a chance for the international community to help steer them towards an inclusionist discourse rather than a radical one.
Thank you for that, Marwan. Moving over to Deb, just like building off of what Marwan said, right? I mean, there are a lot of ifs and contingencies in terms of what Marwan said. And clearly, you can imagine that nobody wants the new Syria to fall under Iran's orbit. Having said that, HKS hasn't really ever ruled a state. It is an Islamic militant jihadist group that now is going to lead a state and shepherd these negotiations with all due respect, Deb, the Europeans, the Americans, the Israelis, the Saudis, and the Emiratis, all of whom are very skeptical of working with Islamists, even mainstream Islamists, let alone Islamist jihadists like former Al-Qaeda. So do you believe that reform of the movement is possible, that we can see Al-Qaeda become the leaders of Al-Qaeda becoming statesmen, if I may use that term, to lead and usher in a democracy or a new order in Syria?
Boy, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm a journalist, so I end up reporting this. And okay, Jolani, he's born in Saudi Arabia. His dad is an oil engineer. He comes back when he's 7, and he moves into Meza in Damascus, which is a pretty tony neighborhood. He doesn't come from Idlib. This is the most conservative part of the country, but that's not where he comes from. He comes from Meza. And his dad is a highly educated oil engineer. He comes back, goes to school. This is the first intifada, Palestinian intifada in Palestine-Israel conflict. so his life is in the middle of that 91. The Americans go to Iraq. So he grows up in this Middle East of chaos and uncertainty. And 2003, the Americans hit Iraq. And he goes. And he goes because so many people just like him are encouraged to go by the Assad regime. First of all, they want to get rid of him. You know, he's kind of a borderline jihadi at this point, and those are the kind of people that go to Iraq. That's a good idea. Perhaps you'll be killed there and not come back and bother us. And so he does go, and he gets arrested almost immediately, convinces the Americans he's an Iraqi, and he stays in Camp Bucca for 4 years. But he meets all the Iraqis, so he joins Al-Qaeda, and then the Syrian uprising comes. So you can see, you know, how, you know, he's an impressionable young guy. He should have gone to college, but he doesn't because life is chaotic for him. Is he, you know, in his bones, is he Al-Qaeda? I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows. I mean, I was saying this earlier on our conversations. What jihadi do you know has a suit in his closet? He wore one to the mosque last Friday. You know, that's almost unimaginable. So there's something about him that is interesting to watch. He built a mall in Idlib last year, and they had a celebration with music, and their conservative colleagues complained about it. So, I mean, there's interesting things to watch about him. I have no idea. I can't make a prediction, but I'm telling you that he doesn't feel like Osama bin Laden. He doesn't feel like Mr. Baghdadi. He's a different character, but can he navigate a state? I don't know.
Excellent. Well, as you said, that's to be determined. Zaid, turning over to you, and as we mentioned, you know, you have extensive experience working in Iraq and Libya, thinking about their transitions. And you know, for many of us watching Syria right now, everybody's sort of hoping for this very Pollyannish, if you may, outcome that will lead to stability, hopefully some form of electoral democracy, representation, economic development. The international community will come in and really want to sort of make sure Syria doesn't fall back to, you know, into chaos or into somebody else's orbit. But let's just be honest, like when we've watched the Middle East in the last 2 decades, the experiment in Iraq did not turn out to be a rosy experience. Libya has devolved into civil war, still trying to come out of that. Where do you see parallels between what's happening now in Syria and with what's happened in Iraq and Libya? And where do you see dissimilarities where maybe because of these differences, Syria might be on a different trajectory?
Yeah, so I mean that's a really difficult question, and I don't, I really don't want to start by being a Cassandra. But the parallels with Iraq and Libya are real, but also I don't think it'll come as a surprise if I say that Syria today is in a much worse situation than either of those countries were when they started out on their current trajectories.
Why? Why do you say that?
Well, why? Okay, for a combination of reasons. Well, I mean, the list of factors that are stacked up against Syria include, this is just to list a few, I mean, the incredible levels of economic hardship that neither Libya and Iraq went through. I mean, both of those countries obviously are oil rich and didn't go through the type of conflict that Syria went through over the past, since 2011. Displacement of half the population now, today. We're not talking about what might potentially could happen in the future, but they're already displaced. There's continuing conflict already today. The conflict isn't over. There's tensions. I mean, the national territory is already divided. So Iraq had that problem with Kurdistan, there's no question. Libya did not. It didn't start with that at the beginning of 2011. But now the territory is definitely divided in Libya. There is already today, not in the future, a plethora of pre-existing armed groups in Syria that are prepared to use force to achieve their aims. The levers of state are controlled by HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a rebel militant group with jihadi origins, potentially still jihadi, we don't really know, with very little experience in governance, just governing a small rural province in the north of Syria. Pre-existing sanctions as well, which won't be lifted automatically. That's definitely not something that I anticipate is going to happen. There's a long list of foreign powers that already today have interests and military forces and proxies in Syria, some of which are still continuing to bomb at will, ongoing fighting, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of things that are stacked against Syria. So, I mean, I don't want to start by being pessimistic, but I mean, it's just, it's hard to escape that. Then the other, what people would argue in favor of Syria is that they'll say that, well, Syrians are tired of war, and that's something actually that some of the leadership now in Damascus is saying. And others have said, but there's a very strong civil society, and they're going to pull things together. So that may be correct. It may happen. However, we heard the same sort of things in a variety of countries, including in Sudan and Tunisia, many places, and it didn't work out for those countries at all. I mean, you know, even looking at, for example, the trade union in Tunisia, which is considered to be this huge actor, so on and so forth. I mean, ultimately, they put up no resistance to Qais Said, and he arrested this part of the leadership, and they kept completely quiet. So I don't know if civil society in Syria will be any different. Potentially, we don't know. The fact that they're tired of war, many people are tired of war, of course, but some people wouldn't mind if there's more conflict. It's not always up to ordinary people. In fact, usually in conflict, it's not up to them. It's mainly up to people who control the war economy. And that's a factor that people are going to have to deal with, and also regional factors as well. The other thing that's worth stating as well is that, I mean, since 2011, around about half the region has gone through transformation, constitutional transformation, governance transformations. Just about every country has failed, just about every single country has made huge mistakes, self-inflicted wounds, and made huge mistakes in their transitions. It's hard to see that Syria is going to learn from those mistakes when no one else did. It could, once again, could happen, right? I mean, anything's possible, but I just don't see why Syria would be the exception. And then the other thing, which is really crucial for this, and this goes directly to Syria, and this is something that I've noted in my professional life from dealing with negotiators across the region, is that Islamists have an irrepressible urge to impose their will on constitutional negotiations. They find it within themselves to believe that only they understand, and only they are the people who can direct countries towards the light. And so whenever there's a disagreement, on every single occasion, they just go it alone. And sometimes it works in their favor, they take over completely, and sometimes it leads to conflict, and sometimes it leads to a coup d'etat. But it never really works out. And then on the issue of whether Syria is going to remain intact or spiral into civil war, I mean, Syria is already split today, right? So Syria is not a unified country today. That's already something that should be noted. And I mentioned before, Iraq, there's a parallel because it was split also in Kurdistan. In Iraq, there were things that were pulling it together to a certain extent. And there's a very strong argument that could be made today that Iraq is much more unified today than it was in 2003. Right. That Syria may end up heading in that direction too. It'll depend to a very large extent on regional powers and the influence that they can bring to bear on HTS and on the Kurdish-led Northeast. But it's also going to depend on HTS itself and whether or not they're going to be willing to negotiate. So far, there's some positive signs there, I should say. There's some positive rhetoric from both sides and some positive signaling, but there's just so much that's uncertain at this stage, and fingers crossed.
Thank you, Zaid. So I'm going to ask you a question that we didn't really go over, but I guess in light of this conversation, I'm going to put it out there. So it seems that maybe all the conditions on the ground, and not to be pessimistic, are veering towards, or at least probabilistically, telling us that we're going to see probably more instability in Syria in the near future than not. And again, to the point that you all mentioned, but Zaid also just mentioned it, which is, you know, Syrians are tired. The region is tired, right? Since 2011, the region has seen instability just spiral out of control. So if we're in this world where there is instability in Syria, what does this mean for Lebanon, which is almost on the verge of, I mean, you know, Lebanon is that story of, you know, a country always being on the verge of collapse, but manages to survive over and over and over. But then you start to have to worry about Jordan, the stability in Jordan, Israel, other parts of the region. So that's the first question. But second, also what concerns me as I look at this picture is that, yes, everybody wants stability in Syria, but when you look at the external actors and the regional actors, there are different interests. Saudi's interests in Syria are different than Qatar's, different than Turkey's, different than Israel's, different than the United States, different than, let's say, HKS, perhaps, given that there are so many different competing interests in Syria right now. How do we get sort of coordination and compromise in ways that sort of puts the Syrian national interest above and beyond all these regional strategic priorities? Marwan.
Look, I think there is a common interest among in the international community for Syria not to go the jihadist route.
Okay.
That's clear in my view. What's also clear is what Zaid said. It's precisely to me because the country is in dire economic condition. It's precisely why the country is prone to maybe acquiesce to outside pressure. You know, in Iraq, in Libya, they had oil. This country doesn't have oil. Half of its population are refugees or displaced people. It's a country that is under sanctions. They cannot make it on their own. And if they are to make it, they will have to, in my view, accept some international outside interference. So, Amani, I'm not really ready to pass judgment either way. I cannot say the experiment will fail, and I cannot say the experiment will succeed. I will note that this is the third iteration of the Arab Spring. The first took place in 2010-11. The second took place in 2019 with 4 Arab countries erupting: Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Sudan. And this is the third one.
Right.
And my observation is that with each iteration, the populations get a bit wiser. We have not seen people going to arms in 2019. And we have not seen them, I mean, here, basically, you know, the country fell without a serious, you know, armed battle. So all I'm saying is, I think the outcome is not going to be either a failed state or a democratic one. This is just another iteration on the way, hopefully, to a peaceful, stable, and prosperous society. But it's going to take time. It's not going to happen in one go or in a decade or in even 2 decades. This is a transformation process in the Arab world that has started, but we are still in the early chapters, in my view. To your other point, again, Lebanon has an opening, but it's only an opening. Okay, yes, the weakening of Hezbollah in Lebanon is going to result in probably, you know, the election of a new president. Is the election of a new president important? Symbolically, yes. Is it going to solve the country's problems? No. This is a kleptocratic society system where, you know, they have a corrupt political elite. And the removing of Hezbollah's, you know, military power, in my view, is a positive development. It's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient one for Lebanon to, you know, transition again to a pluralistic, truly democratic society. For a place like Jordan, you know, the outcome is still mixed. On the positive side, Jordan hopes that at least some refugees will go back. Jordan hopes that the Captagon trade is going to diminish, and we've already seen, you know, Maher al-Assad and all the Assad family basically were involved in this trade. Jordan hopes that Iranian-backed groups or Hezbollah will not, of course, now be at its northern borders. For Jordan, all of this is positive. On the negative side, of course, Jordan does not want an Islamist regime to appear at its borders. But again, the way to do so is not to disengage and alienate the regime, in my view. The way to do so is for the international community to push the regime ever so slightly towards an inclusionist system. And they have the tools to do so, where such tools did not exist in 2014 and in Iraq and Syria.
Excellent. Marwan, just one last question on that. Given that Hezbollah is weakened now in Lebanon, the supply route between Iran and Hezbollah is also sort of off the table. Does this mean that Israel is more likely to move forward with Hamas on a ceasefire in Gaza, given that the Iranian threat has been slightly, increasingly diminished, or do you not see that happening?
My own view is that Israel's objective in Gaza is to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible in a mass transfer to Egypt. I think that's their ultimate objective. And if you're an Israeli, you would understand that if Israel does not want a Palestinian state, and they obviously don't, and they don't want a Palestinian majority, which already exists, then that is the only option that they have, is to try to push as many Palestinians out. Now, you have to balance this with a serious now outside pressure, including from President Trump, who does not want to come to power and have the conflict going in Gaza. And so the indications today are that we might very well arrive at a temporary ceasefire agreement. That's in the works. But does that mean that Israel will have abandoned its aims in Gaza or in the West Bank? I don't think so.
Thank you, Marwan. Deb, to bring this back to you in terms of the conditions on the ground in Syria, veering towards more instability than stability with different regional interests. How would you diagnose this, or at least where do you think this might go?
So I'm going to agree with Marwan in the notion of timelines, and I think there's two. One is it's going to take a while for this government to shake itself out. But here's the other timeline I think that's more important, and that is the international community needs to hurry up. Like, okay, where do you want this to go? You're going to have to figure out sanctions. You're going to have to figure out aid. You're going to have to figure out justice. There are Syrians who want people tried. There are tons who are left in the country that are guilty of war crimes. The people who do this outside, there's been 10 trials so far in Europe, all done under universal jurisdiction. But now you could do hundreds of trials in Syria if you had a new constitution, if you had a new judiciary. And as long as HTS is assigned a terrorist designation, people who have been dealing with this evidence for years can't come to Syria. They can't, because they are supported by governments who say, no, I'm sorry, you can't go because HTS is a terrorist organization. So we've got two timelines we have to be really hyper aware of, and that is now and longer.
Excellent, Deborah. Thank you so much. And so just if I may follow up in the spirit of following up with each of you on the timeline, why do you think the international community is not doing more right now?
I think they're as startled as everybody else about this happening. They're all sort of, talking to each other. Now, there have been, I was shocked when Anthony Blinken said over the weekend, we have direct contact with HTS. I mean, if the CIA is not talking with them, they all ought to be fired. I'd be shocked if they weren't. That is their job. So the Americans are already having direct negotiations. Almost all the neighbors are. There's been, UN channels for these kind of meetings. So it's not that they can't do it; they can. Right. I think that the aid, the sanctions, and the designation is what needs to move a little bit faster, because, certainly people now, Syrians, elites are talking about, we need international help. They do.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much, Deb. Zaid, bringing this question to you. Do you see the lack of consensus among the different regional interests, basically, shaping, or at least sort of shaping the conflict in such a way that it leads to more instability than not moving forward.
I mean, the precedent in the region suggests yes. I mean, we've seen it. We've seen it in many different countries in the region: Libya, Sudan, Yemen, elsewhere. It's. I mean, there's a pattern. There's increasing involvement in other people's problems by countries in the region, internationals as well. It's not just regional powers; it's also international powers too. And efforts to reach consensus are made, never successfully, and leading to prolongation of conflict, or at best, sort of like a truce, an unsteady truce between different sides, and a crystallization of internal boundaries and fragmentation and territorial division, as we've seen in many places. In some countries in the region, there was like a very significant international effort to try to bring international powers to the same table, regional powers to the same table, and bring them to a point of consensus. And I can think of one example, which was the effort that Germany made in connection to the conflict in Libya a few years ago. And they really made a big effort at the level of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and bringing people to the table. But ultimately, it didn't really have any impact. Libya is in the same situation today as it was 10 years ago. So it's really hard to say. And sadly, what tends to happen is that these regional powers that get involved in other people's problems, and therefore, by extension, today in Syria's problems, or who are already involved in Syria's problems, will use the influence that they have in order to undermine what they perceive to be their rivals for regional influence. And whether or not it means that individual groups will pay a price in Syria, it's sad for them, but that's not really their priority, as we've seen in so many other places. I mean, we talk a lot about Syria, but I mean, Sudan is even a more extreme example of this. I mean, Sudan is beyond catastrophic, right? And it's ongoing with no end in sight. So I'm happy that Syria is getting more attention now, and but hopefully it might mean that there will be more of an effort to build consensus. But for now, at least, the precedent that we've seen in the region over the past 15 years doesn't give one cause for hope.
Okay. Well, thank you, Zaid, on that. So we were starting to get a few questions for all our viewers. If you'd like to submit a question, please do it to the Q&A. Let me start with the first one, and maybe each of you can take a stab at it. We have addressed this, but I think it's important to sort of highlight, which is why should the West help an upcoming Islamist regime, while in the first place the support of the Arab League and Turkey might be more helpful? And are we seeing here in Afghanistan 2.0 in the making?
Who first?
I'll attempt an answer. I mean, the West has an interest in helping the regime not become Islamist or jihadist in nature. First, you have the problem of refugees. Europe doesn't want to have refugees from Syria, in great numbers. And if, as a result of the new regime, refugees end up going back, then that's a positive thing. The United States has imposed sanctions through the Caesar's law in Syria, and they also have a role to play in lifting these sanctions conditionally, in my view. But that does not mean that the Arab state, I don't place much weight on the Arab League, frankly, but that doesn't mean that countries of the region are not doing something. They are. Yeah. They just had a meeting in Aqaba where Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Emirates, Jordan, many Arab countries, Egypt, met together to see what can be done. I think, again, and I mentioned this before, neighboring states in particular should not fall into the trap that they encountered in 2003 with the Iraq War, when almost all of them, not all, but almost all of them, took an antagonistic stand against the new Iraqi regime.
Right.
And that really created a vacuum that was used both by Iran and by Al-Qaeda as well. So we should not do this again. What we should do is nudge the new Syrian regime towards pluralism, towards inclusion, and we have a chance to do so. I'm not saying, and I agree totally, I am as cautious as anyone
Right.
about the chances for success, but at least we have some tools that we need to try. They might or might not succeed, but we need to try that. And I hope that the efforts that are already undergoing are doing that.
And so Deb, you want to chime in? I just want to follow up with all of you, and maybe Deb, you can address this. Like, let's just say we hypothetically have a reformed Al-Qaeda becomes far more inclusive, is now ruling, it moves towards constitutional plurality. But doesn't that success pose a risk to all the other sitting Arab regimes who worry about Islamists mobilizing? If Islamists begin to believe that if they can access power, international actors will support them, might this lead to further instability elsewhere? Deb, and you can please answer whatever you want of that question.
Most Arab leaders are Islamists. I mean, some form of Islamists. So HTS is not that far out of the consensus, especially now, because they break with ISIS and Al-Qaeda in 2016. All of a sudden, Jolani is really interested in governance, which is what he does in Idlib. They don't make people, and Idlib is the most conservative part of Syria. So the local population is not upset that women wear headscarves or not, and that it's, they're quite religious, because so is everybody else. The question is, what are they going to look like when they're ruling the entire country? Now, let me go back to something that you asked before, which is why should we care? And why we should care is because Syria is a linchpin country in the region. This is always shocking to Americans, but I remember when I first started covering Syria, I had a coffee with a retired CIA desk officer for Damascus, and she said to me, "Good luck. Americans don't understand Syria at all. We have jobbed it all out to the Israelis because we don't get them. They were a Russian proxy, and we just decided to ignore them." And so we do. Syria, look at the borders, look at where they are, look at how diverse it is. What happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria. And so it matters what happens there. Let us say that the fates are in their favor and Syria emerges as some sort of inclusive Arab state. Do you know what that would do to the rest of the region? It would be quite astonishing. In the same way that during the Arab Spring, the neighbors never really wanted a democratic outcome. They didn't, because it would have some effect on them. So we may see that again this time, but if it goes the other way, then the region changes that way too.
Thank you, Deb.
I think if I can interject, Mani.
Yes, please.
I think the neighbors are not, I totally agree with Deb. If the regime ends up to be, democratic, that poses a challenge to the rest of the region. So I think what the neighboring states are hoping for is not democracy, but some form of inclusion, okay, that would move the system away from a jihadist discourse. And inclusion is possible in Syria, that has a lot of, diverse communities. By the way, I think Syria, by and large, is secular. You have Christians and Alawites and Kurds, and they're not going to accept easily an Islamist lifestyle in the country. So there will be opposition to this, in my view. But at any rate, I think what the objective of neighboring state is, once again, is some form of inclusion that is short of a democratic regime.
So, if I could also say something about this as well. So I'm sure we all agree that countries in the region don't want Syria to be fully democratic and for it to be sort of like a progressive, progressive form of democracy in the region. And in any event, I don't really think that's currently on the cards. I mean, that would be like such an ideal outcome. It would be, that falls within the bounds of science fiction currently, I think. It's not really one of the most likely outcomes. I don't think they really have a problem with an inclusive system either. I mean, Iraq today isn't really democratic. I mean, there's elections, but it's it's a kleptocratic state in the same way that that Lebanon is. But it's very, very integrated into the region. You have all the Gulf monarchies have good relationships with Iraq. Jordan does too. Egypt does too. There's lots of investment that's happening in Iraq. No one really has a problem with that sort of thing. I mean, their view about countries like Iraq and Syria and Lebanon is that they're different to ours. They're much more plural, they're much more diverse, and so therefore, if they need a diverse, inclusive system, then that's good for them. It doesn't really bother us. However, what they will be concerned about in Syria isn't democracy, because I don't think that people think it's a likely outcome. It won't be inclusivity, because I think that they'll think that that's just different. It's a different type of country. What they'll be worried about is HTS being considered to be a successful, not Islamist system, but a jihadi system, like a group of Islamists that went to war and successfully won that war against an existing regime. That's something that will not rest easily with a lot of people. So similar to Algeria back during its dark days as well. That's not something that many countries in the region will be very comfortable with. And so to the extent that they want to make sure that HTS is put in its place as only one component in a much larger mosaic, or to the extent that they're going to undermine it just so that HTS is also undermined in the process, that's not far-fetched. I'm sure that's a concern that many people are worried about.
Thank you so much, Zaid. So we have several questions about what's transpired over the last week, especially as it relates to the timeline, different statements. So I'm going to try to bring a couple questions together. So forgive me if this is overwhelming. So the first is that the HTS offensive in Aleppo happening the day after the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. Number two, as soon as Assad flees, Israel commences a massive bombing campaign against all military intelligence and scientific infrastructure and further expands its occupation of lands in Syria. It's already said that it's going to double the population in the Golan Heights, so that there'll be expansion there. And neither Jolani or any other of the Syrian oppositions has condemned Israel's aggression, bombing campaigns, or expanding occupation of Syrian lands. So there's a whole bundle of questions around the role of Israel in Syria. There's other questions about the US-backed Kurdish forces having control over 80% of Syria's oil fields. Again, that's the US backing the Kurds there. There's questions about Russia and Putin's role in terms of wanting some sort of stability there. Yesterday, Bashar al-Assad released a statement sort of saying that, well, I only fled Damascus after it was clear to me that Damascus would fall. But it appeared that he was positioning himself for something in the way of a day after, but it was not clear. So with all of these different threads going on, like, can you comment about what's going on right now in Syria as we sort of set the stage for whether or not Syria will transition peacefully or not?
Shall I try?
Please.
First, though, look, there are all kinds of conspiracy theories being talked about in the region. One of them is that, Israel is in bed with Jolani, and that Jolani has not condemned Israel's bombing, etc. Israel was perfectly happy with Bashar al-Assad. I mean, the idea that Israel is more comfortable with an Islamist regime than a regime which has not fired a bullet for the last 50 years against Israel is frankly ludicrous in my view. Now, Israel is making use of the turmoil in Syria to once again, solve things militarily, just as they have always done. They don't have any political solutions. Their solutions appear to be military because they're the strong men in the region, and nobody is stopping them from doing so. So there's no question that Israel is playing a dirty game in the Golan Heights, destroying an outdated fleet in the Mediterranean that can do nothing. There's no question that Israel is doing that. But to suggest that Israel, had an interest in an Islamist regime coming to power to replace Bashar al-Assad is just, to me, just way far off.
Let me say, I think Jolani tried very hard to be as inclusive as he could, including reaching out to the Israelis, saying, I have no beef with you. You want to invest here, that'd be great. And the next thing that happens is the Israelis destroy the Navy and all of the air defense. So now he's naked. So he really can't say, gee, I wish you wouldn't do what you're doing. He has nothing, zero. I mean, he is naked as a state. And so the international community played that role. The UN said, please stop to the Israelis. And there's really not a lot he can do. So I think the idea that he's in bed with the Israelis because he didn't say anything is very Middle Eastern, to make a conclusion out of those two events.
And I agree that people read too much into that. And insofar as the comments that Marwan and Deb have already made about Israel, I'm not an expert on Israel, but I mean it chimes with what I understand. But on just to address a couple of the other questions that you listed, Amani.
Yes.
On the sort of like is it a coincidence, or what's the interpretation about why this happened the day after Lebanon fell, or Lebanon, the ceasefire in Lebanon was entered into? I think that now this is part of the accepted narrative, which I think makes sense to me, which is that a lot of us weren't focusing on HTS in Syria during the conflict in Lebanon, but obviously HTS was focusing on itself, right, and it's on its own country, and as any strategist would do, they looked around and figured that the regime in Damascus was weak, that Hezbollah would not be able to come to their aid, that Iran was undermined, that very likely Iraqi militias that previously helped Bashar would not come to their support, that Russia also was bogged down in Ukraine, and therefore they figured this is a good opportunity for us. So when they were encouraged to go, they went, right? And then as Marwan said, they went and then they kept going, right? So that's it. It's not a conspiracy. It's much more just a fact of them figuring strategically this makes a lot of sense, and therefore let's give it an attempt. Let's have a go. And normally things should work out in their favor, and it worked out much more in their favor than they expected, probably. But here we are. And then on the issue of the SDF and its control over the Northeast and oil fields and et cetera, et cetera. So I mean that's also can be very complicated, because I mean in a sense they're in a strong position because of the control that they have. They're more established. They have larger numbers of fighters apparently, although I'm not an expert, but that's what people say. However, at the same time, I mean, so on the issue of Turkey, which is I mean obviously extremely relevant in this case.
Yes.
People have made assumptions about Turkey's position in relation to Kurdish autonomy and the future prospects of a Kurdish state, particularly when it came to Iraq, for example, when the Kurdistan region held its referendum. There were assumptions about Turkey's behavior and its acceptance, potential acceptance. So that's what people were speculating, that Turkey would accept the outcome of a referendum. And in fact, Turkey did not. And in fact, all the factors that led Turkey in the past to be opposed to Kurdish autonomy and any impact that they could have on Turkey's internal dynamics remain the same today as in the past. And Turkey has already made motions in that direction now. And that goes hand in hand with Israel's actions, in the sense that Israel, like any other actor, will see that Syria internally is in disarray. And now is a good opportunity to establish new facts on the ground, right? So Israel moves into what remains of the Golan Heights, and Turkey at the same time is going to seize this opportunity, very likely at least, or making motions in that direction. Maybe it won't happen eventually, but they're making noises in this direction, that they won't tolerate autonomy or future autonomy in the Northeast, in a future constitutional dispensation in Syria. Whether or not that comes to pass is unclear. But at least insofar as we can see from its behavior in Iraq and in other places, I mean, Turkey's interests when it comes to Kurdistan at large remain the same as in the past.
Okay. Thank you so much, Zaid, for that. Okay, we're running up against our time, but if I can give you each 1 minute to just address two things. The Trump administration will be coming in, and the incoming president has already said Syria is a Syrian matter. We don't want to be involved. So all of you talked about the importance of international involvement. We have an administration that says it does not want to be involved. Do we see President Trump having to reverse his stance on that involvement? And number two, what does this all mean for Russia and Russia's influence in the region? Or does this also mean that Russia's position is being weakened because of the ongoing war in Ukraine? Deb, let's start with you.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
So I suppose the good news is that it looks like the rumors are the two very experienced diplomats are going into the Trump administration. These are not Trump warriors. These are people who know the country, and they will likely be in defining positions in the new administration. And so that's good. I think it will be really hard to stay out of this because Syria is such an important country, and the United States, it will matter to its allies. Its allies, Saudi Arabia, matter a lot what happens in Syria. So let's see. I mean, I doubt it will be a full embrace. This is not his style. But to ignore it, probably impossible.
Marwan.
I want to answer the question, what it means for the region, Amani, if I can, since
please.
Deborah is, and I have 2 points to make. One is the Arab Spring is not over. I've made that point many, many times in the past. It might be on ice. It might have failed to achieve its aims, but clearly it's not over. And as long as the problems that have led to the, Arab Spring in the first place have not been addressed by Arab governments, we will see many iterations of the Arab Spring. That's my first point. My second point is, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. Stability cannot be sustained without with brutal force. Without paying attention to the domestic challenges facing each Arab country, without at least adopting a pluralistic discourse. What happens in Syria is not going to stay in Syria.
Yeah.
These lessons have been repeatedly given by the Arab populations in the region, repeatedly. But so far, the status quo forces refuse to listen. Will they listen this time? I doubt it, but they're not going to go away.
Thank you, Marwan. Zid.
Yeah, so I mean, just to start by agreeing with both Deb and Marwan, so I can't see how the United States and Trump can stay out of Syria as other countries are positioning themselves and gaining advantages for themselves, for him to just leave completely and just leave that card completely without trying to gain advantage. It's just not, it's not even his style. It's certainly not the United States' style, and it doesn't come across as being Trump's style, but well, whatever, we'll see, I guess, soon enough. And then on the Arab Spring point, I agree with that completely. I even wrote a book specifically to make that point. So I agree completely with that. I couldn't agree more. And my only query is that it just doesn't last too long. Hopefully, we'll still be alive by the time we reap the rewards. And then on the last point, which neither Deb and Marwan addressed on Russia. I mean, undeniably, Russia's weakened in the region. There's just no question, and they had an entrenched relationship with an actor, and that actor's gone completely. I mean, they dissolved in just a matter of minutes, right? So they may still be able to negotiate, some arrangement with HTS or others in Syria, but it won't be to the same extent. And also, there's something else as well, which is that they were projecting this aura of force, right, in Syria. I mean, we saved the regime in Syria.
Right.
Well, that's gone now, right? It's gone completely. In the same way, and that also impacts Iran, which is the impression or the strong projection was, we're facing up to Israel, we're facing up to the West, and we have these missiles, and we have these and that and the other, and that also did not, it wasn't as strong as people assumed, and that's already having an impact. And I mentioned this earlier, but in Baghdad now, I mean, just the influence that Iranian officials had in the past is not what it used to be. So I mean, in both respects, that's going to change.
Thank you for that, Zaid, and thank you for all your interventions, Deb and Marwan as well, and your insights. It's been such a very valuable conversation, very insightful conversation. I'm grateful to all of you for joining us as our panelists, and all the listeners. Thank you so much for joining us. Please look out for other future events from the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. We will always have our amazing experts here to analyze and dissect what's going on, not only in the Middle East, but across the world and domestically as well. So with that, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.